The Velschen Drift's main drive coughed, shuddered, and died. Captain Torvald Kelsch felt it in his bones before the alarms confirmed it, that low, grinding absence where the engine's hum should have been, the sudden weightlessness of a ship falling off its thrust line. His claws tightened around the merchant console's armrest as the bridge lights flickered from steady blue to emergency amber, and across his convoy's shared frequency, 11 other captains started screaming at once. "Drift, this is the grain carrier Palosi. We're losing formation lock." "Velschen Drift, the sunward promise just clipped the Palosi's aft shield. We need corridor spacing now." Torvald silenced his own panic and hit the all-convoy broadcast. "All vessels, this is convoy lead Kelsch. Cut thrust to station keeping. Nobody accelerates, nobody corrects, nobody touches their helm until I give the word." He waited 2 heartbeats. The screaming stopped. The drift alarms didn't. His first officer, a Rishkari female named Davni whose 4 arms were already flying across the engineering console, pulled up the diagnostics and went perfectly still. "Captain, the main graviton impeller has fractured, not degraded, fractured. The secondary is operating at 11% and falling. We have station keeping for maybe 6 hours. 6 hours. Torvald's mandibles clicked together in the Veshan equivalent of a dry, bitter laugh. They were 3 days from the nearest compact-aligned station, drifting in a corridor between the Palachi sovereignty's outer trade lanes and a stretch of deep void that nobody patrolled because nobody was foolish enough to need patrolling there. 12 ships. 4 grain carriers loaded with 72,000 tons of emergency famine rations, 2 fuel tenders, a medical transport, a refrigeration barge carrying biologicals that would spoil in 40 hours without power. The convoy escort, a single compact patrol corvette, the Sentinel's Promise, whose captain had been complaining about being assigned to babysit merchant ships since the day they'd departed Kello's station. And now his ship, the convoy's lead vessel and its only navigation anchor, was dead in the water. "Get me Sentinel's Promise," Torvald said. The compact Navy officer who appeared on screen was a Drelkathi tall, angular, slate-gray skin stretched over a frame built for gravity 3 times heavier than Torvald's homeworld. Commander Lisseth Vaughn looked at Torvald's emergency-lit bridge with the expression of someone who had predicted exactly this kind of disaster and resented being proven right. "Captain Kelsch, my engineering officer informs me your graviton impeller signature just vanished from our tracking scope. I assume this is not a drill." "Fractured impeller, Commander. We're dead. I need you to take convoy lead and get these ships to Dremeli Station." Lisseth's jaw tightened. "My corvette can escort. It cannot tow 12 merchant vessels through unpatrolled space for 3 days, and without your navigation beacon, half your captains will drift off course within 8 hours. Some of these people are running century-old autopilots." Torvald already knew this. He'd spent 14 years running convoys through the compact's fringe lanes, and he knew exactly what happened when a convoy lost its lead ship. The formation would spread. The slower vessels would fall behind. The faster ones would push ahead, convinced they could make Dremeli on their own. And somewhere in the gap between the 2 groups, in the dark stretch of unlicensed space where comm relays were sparse and rescue was a fantasy, someone would run out of fuel or lose a seal or hit debris. And then someone would die. "I know what we're facing, Commander. That's why I need you to take lead. I can hold formation for perhaps 12 hours. After that, my fuel reserves require me to make for Dremeli at best speed with whoever can keep up." Lisseth paused. "I strongly recommend you broadcast a general distress on the compact emergency frequency. The compact emergency frequency has a response radius of 6 days in this sector. We don't have 6 days. Then broadcast wide, every frequency. Someone may be closer." Torvald stared at the navigation plot. 12 ships, slowly drifting apart like seeds from a burst pod, their formation markers already beginning to scatter on the tactical display. The Pelachi sovereignty's border was 40 light minutes to galactic east. The compact's nearest patrol base was 3 days away, and in every other direction, nothing but void and the faint whisper of background radiation. He opened the emergency console and began composing the distress call. Standard compact format, standard compact encryption, aimed at every relay in range. He didn't bother being selective about the frequency. When you were drowning, you didn't check who was listening. He pressed transmit. The first hour was manageable. The second was tense. By the third, the convoy was coming apart. The Gentle Crossing, a passenger liner carrying 200 civilian colonists bound for Dremeli's agricultural expansion program, reported that her water recycler had failed. Not related to the convoy's engine crisis, the recycler had been limping for weeks, and the stress of the emergency halt had pushed it over the edge. Her captain, a Veshan merchant named Harval, was calm but direct. Convoy lead, I have 48 hours of stored water. After that, I'm rationing a population that includes 90 children. Torvan took the report, logged it, and immediately hailed the Bright Future. Bright Future, I need you to transfer 600 liters of potable water to the Gentle Crossing. Convoy lead, we're a fuel tender. We carry propellant, not. Your emergency reserves include potable water for a crew of 40. Transfer 3/4 of it. The Gentle Crossing has children aboard. A long, resentful silence. Then, confirmed convoy lead. The 5th hour brought the first real emergency. A structural alarm on the grain carrier Lastlight indicated that her cargo bay's atmosphere seals were degrading, not breaching, not yet, but softening under the thermal stress of sitting dead in space with her environmental systems running on minimal power. If the seals failed, the famine rations in that bay, 18,000 tons, would be exposed to vacuum. Useless. Spoiled. Torvan dispatched Davni to coordinate a remote diagnostic with the Lastlight's engineer, a Pelachi technician who was, by his own admission, primarily qualified in propulsion systems and had never dealt with atmospheric containment. Together, over a scratchy comlink degraded by the convoy's dwindling power reserves, they walked through a manual override procedure that Davni improvised from the Velshan Drift's own maintenance archive. It took 90 minutes. The seals held. The rations were safe. For now. The 7th hour was when Torvan started making the calculations he'd been avoiding. 12 ships, 4 critical systems failing across 3 vessels, 1 escort with limited fuel, no response to the distress call. He pulled up the convoy manifest on his emergency console and looked at the numbers. 437 souls across the formation. 200 colonists on the Gentle Crossing, including the 90 children. 42 crews spread across the 4 grain carriers. 18 medical personnel on the Mercy's Reach. The fuel tender's skeleton crews, his own crew of 12. Commander Lisseth's corvette crew of 31. 437 people, his responsibility, drifting. The Sentinel's promise was burning fuel just holding station, and Lisseth's tone was growing sharper with each update. Kelsh, my fuel calculations now show I can remain with the convoy for 4 more hours before I must depart for Dremeli. When I leave, I can take the Gentle Crossing under tow 1 vessel only. The colonists take priority. The rest of the convoy will need to drift until the compact responds. And how long until the compact responds, Commander? At current response times for this sector, 4 to 6 days. 4 to 6 days. The Coldwalk's biologicals would spoil in 40 hours. The Lastlight's cargo seals were deteriorating. The Palosi was losing atmosphere. The Bright Course was already dead, and the Gentle Crossing would run out of water in 2 days even with the fuel tender's emergency reserves. Torvan ran the math 3 times. Each time the answer was the same: not everyone was going to make it. He was composing a priority evacuation plan, which ships could take on extra crew, which vessels could be abandoned, which cargo would have to be sacrificed when Davni spoke. "Captain, I'm receiving a communication on a frequency I don't recognize." He looked up. "Compact emergency band." "No, not compact, not Pelachi. The encoding protocol is I've never seen this encoding. It's coming in on the old relay bounce-back frequency, the same band our distress signal went out on." The signal had gone out in all directions, and because the universe had a sense of humor that Torvan Kelsch would not appreciate until much later, the signal had bounced off a defunct relay satellite that nobody knew was still powered, ricocheted through a frequency band that hadn't been used in commercial traffic for 300 years, and landed squarely on the emergency monitoring array of a species that the Compact's official charts listed as limited spacefaring, non-participant. Restricted contact. Earth's listening post Bravo 7 logged the signal at 3:47 Terran Standard Time. The duty officer, a human woman named Sergeant Reyes, read the decoded header, checked the originating coordinates twice, and picked up the direct line to Fleet Communications at Armstrong Station. "Fleetcom, this is LP Bravo 7. I have a decoded compact format distress call from an unaffiliated convoy, 12 vessels, stranded in the Pelachi outer lanes due to drive failure. Convoy lead is requesting any available assistance. Signal integrity is strong. They're broadcasting wide, not aimed at us. We caught a bounce off relay Echo 14. A pause. Bravo 7, confirm relay Echo 14. That relay's been decommissioned for 2 centuries. Apparently it's still listening, sir. The signal is clean. They've got families aboard, grain carriers, medical transport. And they're drifting." Another pause, longer this time, then, "Stand by Bravo 7, routing to 9th Patrol Group." Sergeant Reyes waited. She'd been stationed at Bravo 7 for 11 months, and in that time she'd logged exactly 0 live distress calls. The listening post was a relic, one of hundreds that Earth maintained along its perimeter, monitoring frequencies that most of the galaxy considered obsolete, because the Terran naval doctrine held that a frequency was never truly dead until the last transmitter using it was confirmed destroyed. Nobody had confirmed relay Echo 14. So it was still on the list, and now it had delivered. 3 minutes later the reply came back. "Bravo 7 Fleetcom. 9th Patrol Group has dispatched the TSS Carthage, destroyer escort class, with the auxiliary tender patients and the fleet medical cutter Kindness. ETA to convoy coordinates, 9 hours, 14 minutes. They're requesting you maintain signal lock on the bounce path and provide continuous relay." Reyes blinked. A destroyer, a tender, and a medical cutter, for a convoy that hadn't asked Earth for help, for a signal that had reached them by accident through a relay that should have been dead. "Fleetcom confirmed, maintaining signal lock. Bravo 7 out." She leaned back in her chair, looked at the blinking indicator that represented a 2-century-old relay satellite still faithfully doing its job, and whispered, "Good girl." 9 hours into the crisis, Torvan Kelsch was holding his convoy together through sheer force of will and a vocabulary of profanity that spanned 3 languages. The grain carrier Palosi had lost its secondary cooling system and was venting atmosphere from a cracked hull plate. The refrigeration barge Coldwalk had burned through its backup power trying to keep 60 tons of biological samples from spoiling, and was now running on batteries that wouldn't last another 2 hours. The medical transport Mercy's Reach had taken aboard the crew of the fuel tender Bright Course, which had suffered a cascade failure in its containment system and was now drifting unmanned, a slowly expanding cloud of toxic propellant surrounding it like a shroud. The Sentinel's Promise was holding formation, but Commander Lisseth had made clear that her window was closing. Her corvette's fuel was finite. In 3 hours, she would have to make the calculation between staying with the convoy and reaching Dremeli station before her own tanks ran dry. Torvan had made the rounds. He talked down the captain of the grain carrier Sunward Promise, who wanted to break formation and run for the border. He'd walked a terrified communications officer on the passenger liner Gentle, crossing through the process of manually realigning her navigation computer after a power surge had wiped its memory. He'd convinced the captain of the second fuel tender, the Bright Future, to share half its remaining reserves with the Coldwalk to keep the biologicals alive for another few hours. Every conversation had cost him something: patience, energy, credibility, hope. The passenger liner Gentle crossing was the one that frightened him most. Harval had stabilized the water situation with the fuel tender's emergency reserves, but now the liner's navigation computer, wiped by the power surge, manually realigned by a terrified comms officer who'd never done the procedure before, was drifting out of alignment again. The colonists aboard were civilians, families, children who had never been in space before this voyage and who were now sitting in dimming corridors, asking their parents why the ship had stopped moving. Torvan had spoken to Harval 4 times in the past 2 hours. Each conversation had been shorter than the last because there was less to say. The water would last another 30 hours. The navigation fix would hold for maybe 12. And after that, the Gentle crossing would be blind, drifting, and carrying 200 people who had signed up for a new life on a colony world, and were now looking at the possibility of dying in the corridor between here and there. Now he sat on his own dead bridge, watching his formation markers drift on a screen powered by the last reserves of his ship's backup grid, and he knew the math. Nobody was coming. The Compact's response time in this sector was measured in days. The Pelachi sovereignty wouldn't cross its own border for non-citizens, and the wide broadcast distress call had gone out 9 hours ago with no response. The Coldwalk's captain called in. "Convoy lead, my batteries are at 14%. I've shut down everything except the primary refrigeration unit. If we lose those biologicals, Kelsh, those are vaccine cultures for the Dremeli outbreak. Not just food, medicine. If they spoil, the colony loses both." Torvan hadn't known about the vaccines. He checked the manifest. Morven was right. Buried in the Coldwalk's cargo listing, between the biological samples and the research cultures, were 800 units of Dremeli-specific antiviral compound, enough to inoculate the colony's entire Atrisk population. Losing the Coldwalk's cargo didn't just mean losing research materials. It meant losing the colony's defense against a disease that had already killed 300 people. The weight of it settled on Torvan's shoulders like a physical load. His mandibles clicked. The sound was soft, dry, defeated. "Captain," Davni's voice was carefully controlled. "I'm receiving a communication on a frequency I don't recognize. It's not Compact standard. It's not Pelachi. The encoding protocol is—" She paused, her secondary arms freezing mid-keystroke. "Captain, it's on the old relay bounce-back frequency. The same band our distress signal went out on." Torvan straightened. "Who's broadcasting?" "I can't. The call sign is in a language our systems don't have in their primary database. Running translation." A moment, then. "The call sign translates as Terran Solar Ship Carthage. They're broadcasting in the clear. No encryption. Message reads, Compact Convoy Lead, this is TSS Carthage, Terran 9th Patrol Group. We received your distress signal via relay bounce. We are inbound to your coordinates with engineering, medical, and supply support. ETA 41 minutes. Please confirm your formation status and identify vessels requiring immediate assistance. Carthage standing by." The bridge was silent. Torvan read the message twice on Davni's screen. Then he read it a third time. "Terran," he said, those are humans." "Yes, Captain. The signal wasn't aimed at their frequency. They caught the bounce off the old relay." Torvan sat with that for a moment. He knew humans from Compact briefings, a restricted species, limited to their own patrol zones under the non-participant accord. Young, aggressive, according to the cautionary files, possessed of a disproportionately large military for a species of their galactic age. And now, apparently, possessed of listening posts on frequencies that nobody else was using, attached to relays that nobody else knew were still active. He looked at the evacuation plan still glowing on his console, the plan that said some of his people were going to die. He deleted it. "Open a channel," he said. The face that appeared on screen was weathered, calm, and unmistakably alien to Torvald's eyes, flat, soft-skinned, with small eyes and a mouth that seemed designed for far more expression than any Veshan face could manage. The human wore a dark uniform with a high collar, and behind the officer was a bridge that hummed with the quiet confidence of a vessel that knew exactly where it was going. "Convoy Lead Kelsh, I'm Commander Natalia Torres, commanding TSS Carthage. We have you on scope. I count 12 vessels, one with a propellant cloud indicating a containment breach, and your lead ship is showing 0 thrust signature. Is that accurate?" "That is accurate, Commander Torres. But I should tell you we did not send the distress call to your people. It was a general broadcast. We weren't aware any Terran assets were in range." Torres smiled. It was a small expression, barely a movement, but Torvald would remember it for years. "Captain Kelsh, the signal hit one of our old relays. We caught the bounce. Doesn't matter who you aimed it at. You needed help. We're here." She said it like it was simple. Like crossing a patrol boundary to answer a distress call from a species she'd never met, for a convoy that hadn't asked for her, was the most ordinary thing in the universe. "Now," Torres continued, leaning forward, "let's talk about your convoy. I need to know which ships are in immediate danger, which ones can hold for another few hours, and which ones just need a tow. I've got engineering teams, medical staff, and a tender carrying enough fuel to top off your entire formation. Let's get to work." The Carthage arrived first, a sleek, dark-hulled destroyer that came out of the void like a blade, its running lights cutting through the drifting propellant cloud around the abandoned bright course with surgical precision. Behind it, the tender patients materialized a broad, flat-backed vessel bristling with fuel lines and cargo cranes, already deploying service drones before it had fully dropped out of its approach burn. And behind the patients, smaller and quieter, the medical cutter Kindness, its hull painted with the universal medical sigils that even species who'd never met humans recognized as a promise. Torvald watched from his dead bridge as the human ships took formation around his scattered convoy with the kind of practice coordination that spoke of a doctrine rehearsed 1,000 times. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no questions about authorization or jurisdiction, or whether these merchant ships were worth the fuel expenditure. Torres was on the comm constantly, issuing orders with the calm authority of a woman who had done this before and would do it again. "Patience, begin fuel transfer to the Cold Walk. She's on battery power and her biologicals are critical. Engineering Team Alpha, I want you on the Palosi. She's venting from a cracked hull plate. Seal it, pressurize, and report. Kindness, move to the Mercy's Reach. She's carrying extra crew from the Bright Course, and her medical facilities are overwhelmed. I want triage in 15 minutes. Torvald listened to his own convoy captains, responding to Tor's instructions with the stunned compliance of people who had been drowning, and just felt a hand close around their wrist. The captain of the Cold Walk, a Rishkari trader named Morvan, actually laughed when the patient's fuel drone locked onto his intake port, a high, disbelieving sound, half relief and half shock. "Convoy lead, this is Cold Walk. They're pumping fuel. Actual fuel. My biologicals are going to make it. Whoever these people are, they're pumping fuel." "Confirmed, Cold Walk. They're called humans." A pause. "Are they? Is that the restricted species? The ones the compact says are too aggressive for general contact?" Torvald looked at the image of the Carthage on his tactical display, the destroyer hovering protectively over the listing Palosi. while its engineering team suited up for a hull repair and allowed his mandibles to click in something that was almost amusement. Apparently so, Coldwalk. The first human Torvald met in person was Lieutenant Commander Alexei Volkov, the Carthage's chief engineer, who came aboard the Velsian drift through the emergency airlock with a team of 6, carrying equipment cases that looked like they'd been packed for exactly this kind of disaster. Volkov was a tall human, broad across the shoulders, with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of focused, practical concentration. He looked at Torvald's fractured graviton impeller on the engineering display, nodded once and said, "Right. Fractured, not degraded. Good news is, fractured is fixable. Degraded means replacement, and I don't carry Velsian impellers, but a fracture we can weld that. Going to need about 4 hours and access to your main engineering bay." Torvald stared at him. "You can repair a Velsian graviton impeller." "I can repair most things that fracture. Physics is physics. The alloy's different, but I've worked with graviton systems before. The Coalition uses a similar principle in their deep-haul freighters, and we pulled one of those apart for study about 8 years back. It won't be pretty, but it'll hold until you reach a proper yard." "Lieutenant Commander, your compact has us listed as a restricted contact species. How do you know Velsian engineering?" Volkov set down his equipment case and met Torvald's compound eyes with a directness that was almost startling. "Captain, we're engineers. We study everything. It's not personal, it's just that when someone sends a distress call on a 300-year-old frequency and it bounces off a relay we forgot we still owned, we figure we should be ready for whatever we find at the other end." He smiled. It was a small, practical expression. "Now, your engineering bay. Which way?" Torvald led him down. On the way to the engineering bay, they passed through the crew corridor where Torvald's 12 Velsian merchants were standing in a loose cluster, watching the procession of human engineers with expressions that ranged from curious disbelief to something approaching alarm. One of the younger crew members, a navigation apprentice named Tessera who had been aboard for only 6 months, stepped forward and addressed Volkov directly. "Are you going to take the ship?" Volkov stopped. The question hung in the corridor like a dropped tool. "No, ma'am," Volkov said. The translator rendered his tone as patient, direct, and entirely without condescension. "We're going to fix the ship. Then we're going to leave. You'll be on your way to Dremeli inside of 6 hours. Tessera's mandibles clicked rapidly, anxiety, not hostility. "The compact files say your species is dangerous, restricted contact, military aggressive. They say you." "I know what the files say." Volkov set down one of his equipment cases and met her compound eyes. "Ma'am, I'm an engineer. My team and I are here because your captain sent a distress call and we happened to hear it. We're going to weld your impeller, check your drive housing, and make sure your ship can get you where you're going. That's the beginning and the end of what we're here to do." He paused. "If it helps, I'm scared of your mandibles. They look like they could take my finger off, but I'm still here to fix your engine." Tessera stared at him. Then her mandibles clicked again, but differently this time. Amusement. She stepped aside. Volkov picked up his case and continued walking. Torvald filed the exchange away. It was a small moment, but it told him something that the compact's cautionary files never would. These people understood fear. They understood it in others, and they knew how to diffuse it. Not with authority, not with reassurance in the abstract, but with specificity. "Here is what I am going to do. Here is when I am going to leave. Here is the only thing you need to worry about, nothing." The next 4 hours were the strangest, most disorienting, and ultimately most moving hours of Torvald Kelsch's 14-year career in the merchant fleet. He watched Volkov's engineering team disassemble his main drive housing with a speed and competence that bordered on offensive. They'd brought their own cutting tools, their own welding rigs, their own diagnostic equipment, and when Torvald's engineering chief, a grizzled Velsian named Krelt, pointed out that the fracture had propagated into the impeller's harmonic dampening ring. Volkov simply nodded, pulled a second equipment case from the pile, and said, "Yeah, we packed for that." While the engineering team worked, Torvan coordinated with Tors and watched the human ship systematically stabilize his convoy. The patients had finished fueling the cold walk and moved on to the bright future, topping off the fuel tender's tanks so it could resume supplying the rest of the formation. The Kindness had docked with the Mercy's Reach and was transferring medical supplies and 2 surgical teams. The Bright Course's crew had included 3 individuals with injuries from the containment breach, and the Kindness's surgeons were treating them alongside the Mercy's Reach's own overwhelmed medical staff. The Palosi's hull breach was sealed in 45 minutes. Torvan received the report from the Palosi's captain, a young Drelkathi woman named Seshka, who sounded like she was trying very hard not to cry. Convoy lead, the human engineers patched the plate and ran a pressure test. They said the seal will hold for 6 months minimum, probably longer. They also fixed our secondary cooling system. I didn't ask them to. They just saw it was down and fixed it. Confirmed Palosi. That seems to be how they operate. The crisis aboard the Gentle Crossing came next. The passenger liner's water recycler hadn't just failed, it had ruptured, flooding a lower deck with contaminated coolant. The liner's engineer had sealed the compartment, but the 200 colonists were now confined to the upper 3 decks, overcrowded, frightened, and dealing with air scrubbers that were laboring to handle the additional load. Tors dispatched the Kindness to the Gentle Crossing as soon as the medical cutter finished its initial work on the Mercy's Reach. The Kindness sent over not just medical personnel but 2 environmental engineers who ripped out the ruptured recycler, installed a portable Terran unit from their own ship's spare inventory, and had clean water flowing to all decks within 90 minutes. The Kindness's chief medical officer, a human named Dr. Adiz Akafer, personally walked the colonist decks, conducting health checks on the 90 children, distributing nutritional supplements, and explaining through a translation device that she wore on her collar like a piece of jewelry that they were safe now, that the water was clean, that someone was here. Torvan received the report from Harval, the Gentle Crossing's captain. The old Veshan's voice cracked. Convoy lead. The human doctor is sitting with the children. She's sitting on the deck with them, showing them how the translation device works. They're laughing, Kelsh. My passengers are laughing. An hour ago they were rationing water and I was trying to decide which deck to evacuate first. Confirmed, Gentle Crossing. Hold your position. Then the Bright Course became a problem again. The abandoned fuel tender's containment breach had been slowly worsening, and 6 hours after the humans' arrival, the propellant cloud surrounding the derelict ship began to interact with residual radiation from the vessel's damaged reactor shielding. The result was a low-level radioactive plume that began drifting toward the Sunward Promise and the Last Light. Tors saw it before anyone else did. The Carthage's sensors were sharper than anything in the convoy, and her tactical officer flagged the radiation signature the instant it crossed the safe threshold. Tors was on the convoy frequency within seconds. Sunward Promise, Last Light begin lateral drift, bearing 270 minimum safe distance from the Bright Course plume. Move now. Carthage is repositioning to shield your withdrawal. The Carthage swung around the formation like a gate closing, placing its own hull between the radioactive plume and the 2 vulnerable merchant ships. Torvan watched on the tactical display as the destroyer's radiation shields, military grade, far heavier than anything a merchant vessel carried, absorbed the plume's output while the Sunward Promise and Last Light crawled to safe distance. "Commander Tors," Torvan said, "your ship is absorbing radiation to shield my convoy." "That's what the shielding is for, Captain. My crew is behind hardened bulkheads. Your people aren't. Seems like a straightforward decision." Straightforward. She kept using that word, or words like it. as though every act of extraordinary generosity was merely the obvious thing to do. As though a military destroyer shielding merchant ships with its own hull was standard procedure, rather than a sacrifice that the compact Navy's rulebook would never have authorized. The bright course itself was becoming an escalating hazard. Torres made the call without consulting anyone. "Patience, I need a disposal team on the bright course. Safe the reactor, vent the remaining propellant to deep void, and scuttle the hull to navigational standards. We're not leaving a radioactive derelict in a trade corridor." The Patience dispatched a team in environmental suits. They boarded the dead fuel tender, killed the reactor, and vented the toxic propellant into a trajectory that would carry it into deep void, harmless. Then they stripped the bright course of its emergency beacon, its log recorder, and its crew personal effects, everything that could be salvaged and returned to the crew now sheltering on the Mercy's reach, and set the hull on a controlled descent toward the nearest stellar mass. Torvald watched the bright course's marker fade from his tactical display. The ship had been part of his convoy for 3 years. He'd known its captain, a quiet Rashkari named Selin, who was now aboard the Mercy's reach with burns on his upper arms from the containment breach. The ship was gone, but its crew was alive, because humans had come. Commander Lisseth of the Sentinel's Promise contacted Torvald on a private channel. The compact Navy officer's voice was careful, measured, stripped of her earlier irritation. "Captain Kelsch, I want you to know that I have logged the Terran response and will be including it in my report to Compact Naval Command. What they are doing here is not covered by any protocol I am aware of. They are rendering aid to a convoy from a polity that has them classified as restricted. They are doing so without compensation, without treaty obligation, and without hesitation." "I noticed, Commander. I also want you to know that the Carthage's commander has not once asked me for authorization, clearance, or permission. She simply informed me that her ships were here to help and asked me to coordinate my patrol pattern with her formation plan. I have chosen to comply. That seems wise." "Kelsch," Lisseth's voice dropped. "They brought enough fuel to top off the entire convoy. They brought medical teams. They brought engineering kits for 3 different species drive systems, for a bounced signal that reached them by accident. What kind of people keep ships packed like that?" Torvald didn't have an answer. Not then, not yet. While the engineering work continued, Torres contacted Torvald with a question he hadn't expected. "Captain Kelsch, I understand your convoy is carrying emergency famine rations for the Dremali colony. Is the famine situation critical?" "It is. The Dremali harvest failed 8 months ago. These rations are the Compact's relief shipment. If they don't arrive within the next 72 hours, the colony's reserves will be exhausted." Torres absorbed this without visible reaction. Then, "Captain, once your drive is repaired, your convoy's maximum transit speed will be limited by your slowest vessel. At current formation speed, you're looking at 3 days to Dremali Station. I'd like to offer an alternative. The Patience can take your 4 grain carriers under tow. She's built for it. She's got the mass drivers, and we can push the transit down to about 36 hours. The rest of your convoy can follow at best speed, with the Carthage running escort." Torvald felt something shift in his chest. It was a physical sensation, unfamiliar and disconcerting, as though something that had been clenched tight for 9 hours was slowly, painfully unclenching. "Commander Torres, you've already done more than anyone could ask. You've repaired my ship, fueled my convoy, treated my wounded, and sealed a hull breach on a vessel that isn't yours. You don't need to tow us." "Captain Kelsch," Tor's voice was quiet. "There are people starving on Dremali. You've got the food. We've got the engine power. I'm not going to sit here and watch the math work out to too late when I've got a tender with mass drivers. The offer's on the table." He accepted. He didn't even hesitate. The tow configuration took 2 hours to set up. Torvald watched from his newly humming bridge, the impeller repair was holding. The harmonic dampener patched with a Terran alloy compound that Krelt kept examining with something approaching religious fascination. As the Patience deployed its mass driver tow cables and locked onto the 4 grain carriers with the careful, practiced movements of a vessel that had clearly done this before. During the setup, Torvon walked his ship. It was something he did after every crisis, a physical survey, deck by deck, to see what was broken, what was holding, what needed attention. But this time the walk had a different quality, because on every deck he found evidence of the human's work. In the engineering bay, Volkov's team had not only repaired the impeller, but had also replaced 3 corroded coolant lines that Torvon's own maintenance schedule had flagged for replacement at the next port call. They'd left the old lines neatly coiled in a storage bin with a handwritten note in Terran script that his translator rendered as, "These were close to failure. Replaced with universal spec. Should hold for 18 months. Volkov." In the cargo hold, a human technician had recalibrated the environmental controls that kept the hold's atmosphere stable for the famine rations. The recalibration had extended the shelf life of the grain by an estimated 2 months. Nobody had asked for this. The technician had simply noticed the calibration was off, fixed it, and moved on. In the crew quarters, one of the Carthage's medical officers had conducted health screenings for Torvon's entire crew, 12 Veshan merchants, who hadn't seen a proper medical professional in 4 months. The officer had left behind a supply of nutritional supplements tailored to Veshan biology, along with a data chip containing updated health protocols. Torvon stood in the corridor outside the crew quarters, holding the data chip, and felt the unclenching sensation again, stronger this time. He found Volkov in the engineering bay, packing up the last of his equipment. The human engineer was covered in lubricant and metal shavings, and he looked tired in a way that Torvon recognized the specific exhaustion of someone who had been working at full capacity for hours, and was now running on nothing but discipline, and whatever the human equivalent of stimulant T was. "Lieutenant Commander, your team has done work that goes far beyond the scope of a distress response. I want you to know that." Volkov looked up. "Captain, when we get a call, any call, we bring everything we've got. That's how we train. That's how we pack. My commander told me once that you don't bring what you think they'll need. You bring what they might need. And then you bring a little more. You replaced my coolant lines. They were about to fail. You recalibrated my cargo hold. The settings were off by 3%. Would have cost you 6 weeks of shelf life on those rations. You gave my crew health screenings." Volkov shrugged. It was a remarkably expressive gesture for something so simple. We were here, they needed it, seemed like the thing to do. Torvon's mandibles clicked softly. "Lieutenant Commander, might I ask you a question?" "Shoot." "Your species is listed by the compact as restricted, limited spacefaring, non-participant, and yet you maintain listening posts on decommissioned relay frequencies. You staff patrol groups with engineering teams prepared for multi-species drive repair. You carry fuel reserves sufficient for an entire convoy. You bring medical supplies for species you've never officially contacted." He paused. "Why?" Volkov set down his tool kit and leaned against the bulkhead. The human's face was doing something complex. Torvon couldn't read the expression precisely, but it seemed to involve both amusement and something deeper, something warmer. "Captain Kelsch, I'm going to tell you something that'll probably make the compact bureaucrats very uncomfortable. We listen to everything, not because we're spying, because we believe that when someone's in trouble, the worst thing you can do is not hear them. So we keep the old relays on the list. We keep the old frequencies monitored. We pack for everything because we don't know who's going to call, or what language they'll call in, or what kind of drive they'll need fixed." He smiled. "Your distress signal wasn't aimed at us. It bounced off a relay that everyone else forgot about. But we didn't forget, Because the day we stop listening is the day someone drowns in the dark because nobody was paying attention, and we don't do that. Torvald stood in his own engineering bay, surrounded by the evidence of human generosity: the repaired impeller, the replaced coolant lines, the tool marks on his consoles where alien hands had worked alongside his own crew, and he understood something that the compact's classification files had entirely failed to capture. These people weren't aggressive. They were attentive. They were the species that kept the lights on in the relays that everyone else had abandoned, because they believed that someone, somewhere, might still need them. The convoy moved, with the Patience's mass drivers pushing the 4 grain carriers at speeds they'd never been designed to reach. The formation burned toward Dremeli at a pace that turned 3 days into 36 hours. The Carthage ran escort alongside the slower vessels: the fuel tenders, the medical transport, the refrigeration barge, the passenger liner, and Torvald's own ship, keeping formation with the effortless precision of a warship pretending to be a sheepdog. Torvald used the transit time to do what he did best: manage his convoy, but the nature of the management had changed. Instead of crisis calls and emergency patches, he was fielding reports of human assistance that ranged from the practical to the absurdly generous. The Coldwalk's captain reported that the Patience's crew had not only fueled his ship, but had also repaired his primary refrigeration unit, which had been running at 60% for the past month, to full operational capacity. "They asked me what was wrong with the unit," Morvan said, his voice carrying the tone of someone describing a miracle. "I told them it was a compressor seal. They had a compressor seal." "Captain Kelsch, they had a Rishkari specification compressor seal on a human tender." "How is that possible?" "I'm beginning to think they carry everything, Morvan." The Gentle Crossing reported that the Carthage had transmitted a complete updated navigation database for the sector, including hazard markings that the compact's own charts didn't include: debris fields, radiation zones, and a newly charted asteroid cluster that would have been directly in the convoy's path if they'd continued on their original route. The database was offered freely, with a note that read, "Compiled from our own surveys. No restrictions on use or distribution." TSS Carthage Navigation. Commander Lisseth called Torvald again, privately. "The human commander just offered to let my corvette refuel from their tender, for free. She said, and I quote, 'You've been babysitting this convoy for days, Commander. Let us top you off so you can do your job without worrying about your tanks.' Kelsch, I am a compact Navy officer. I have never been offered free fuel by a foreign military." "Did you accept?" "Of course I accepted. I'm not an idiot." Torvald almost smiled. His mandibles didn't work that way, but the impulse was there. The Sentinel's Promise pulled alongside the Carthage for the refueling transfer, and for 20 minutes the compact Navy corvette and the Terran destroyer flew in tandem, hull to hull, close enough that Torvald could see the crew of both ships through their respective viewports. Lisseth's Drelkathi crew, military professionals, disciplined, accustomed to rigid protocol, stood at their stations and watched the human fuel drones lock onto their intake ports with a fascination that bordered on reverence. Lisseth's first officer, a Drelkathi lieutenant named Koreth, contacted Torvald directly on a personal channel. "Convoy lead, I hope you don't mind the irregular communication. I wanted to tell you something. During the fuel transfer, the Carthage's sensor officer transmitted a full tactical sweep of the surrounding 6 sectors to our navigation computer. Unasked. Unprompted. The sweep includes 23 navigational hazards that our own sensor suite missed, 4 of which are directly relevant to our patrol route." His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that sounded like a man reconsidering everything he'd been taught. "Captain Kelsch, our sensor suite is state-of-the-art compact technology. The Terrans just gave us data that proves theirs is better, and they gave it to us for nothing." "Did they give you any conditions?" "None. The file header says compliments of TSS Carthage navigation. Safe travels. That's all." Torvald stored that alongside everything else he was learning about humans, they didn't just help, they helped comprehensively. They helped in ways you didn't know you needed until the data was already in your system, and the gap you'd never noticed was filled. 8 hours into the transit, the Gentle Crossing's primary power grid failed. The passenger liner shuddered, her lights dying section by section like a candle being snuffed. 200 colonists were plunged into darkness. The portable water recycler the humans had installed kept running on its own internal battery, but the liner's life support, heating, and atmospheric processors went down simultaneously. Torvald was on the comm instantly. Gentle Crossing report. Harval's voice came through scratchy and strained. Convoy lead, main power grid cascade failure. We're on emergency batteries. We have maybe 4 hours of atmosphere at current population density. The children, his voice broke. The children are in the dark, Kelsh. Tors cut in on the frequency before Torvald could respond. Gentle Crossing, this is Carthage. I'm sending a power relay team to your vessel. They'll cross-connect our auxiliary reactor to your main bus. You'll have full power in 30 minutes. Kindness, I need Dr. Akafer back aboard the Gentle Crossing. The passengers are going to need stabilization. The relay team crossed to the Gentle Crossing in a shuttle that detached from the Carthage's belly like a wasp leaving a nest. They brought portable lighting units that they distributed through the liner's corridors before they even started on the power grid, because someone on Tor's crew had understood that before you fix the technical problem, you address the terror. The children stopped crying when the lights came on. Dr. Akafer arrived 12 minutes later and moved through the passenger decks with the calm, steady presence of someone whose training included not just medicine, but the architecture of reassurance. The cross-connection took 27 minutes. The Gentle Crossing's lights came back on, powered by a Terran auxiliary reactor feeding through a jury-rigged interface that the human engineers had designed on the spot. In the dark, using specifications for Veshan power systems that they pulled from a database they apparently carried with them at all times. Harval called Torvald afterward. The old captain's voice was raw. They brought lights for the children first, Kelsh. Before the reactor, before the power grid, before anything else, they brought lights for the children. Torvald closed his eyes. His mandibles clicked once, softly, involuntarily. The most difficult moment came 14 hours into the tow, when a debris field that wasn't on any compact chart materialized directly in the convoy's path. The Carthage's forward sensors picked it up first, a scattered mass of metallic fragments, the remains of some ancient vessel that had broken apart centuries ago and drifted into the trade lane uncharted. At the convoy's current speed under tow, they would hit the densest concentration in 11 minutes. Tors immediately ordered the patients to begin a course correction, angling the towed grain carriers around the worst of the debris. But the grain carrier Lastlight, trailing at the edge of the formation, received the course change data late. Her navigation computer, still running on the manual override from hours earlier, lagged behind the updated trajectory. Her captain, a nervous Palachi trader named Dervin who had been on edge since the beginning of the crisis, saw debris fragments pinging off his forward shields and panicked. He broke formation, accelerating directly into the path of the patient's tow cables. What happened next took 11 seconds. Tors saw the collision course on her tactical display and issued 3 orders in rapid succession. Patience, emergency tow release on cable 3. Carthage helm, hard burn, intercept angle delta 7. Lastlight, cut your engines now. The Patience released cable 3. The Carthage surged forward, its destroyer engines blazing, and placed itself physically between the Lastlight and the tow line, absorbing the shock of the Lastlight's acceleration against its own hull with a grinding impact that Torvald heard through the convoy frequency as a deep, structural groan. Then Tor's voice, calm, unhurried, exactly as measured as it had been 9 hours ago. Lastlight, this is Carthage. You're clear. Cut your engines. I've got you." Dervin cut his engines. The Carthage backed off, trailing a thin line of vented coolant from a ruptured exterior line. The tow cable was resecured. The formation reformed. The whole crisis lasted less than a minute. Torvan hailed Tors. "Commander, your ship took damage." "Exterior coolant line." "My engineers are already on it. Should be sealed in 20 minutes. You put your destroyer between a panicking merchant ship and a tow cable." "That's what the ship is for, Captain Kelsch." Tor's face was unreadable for a moment. Then she smiled, that small, quiet expression that Torvan was beginning to understand was the human equivalent of "everything is fine. This is what we do. I didn't bring a warship out here to watch it sit pretty. I brought it out here to keep people safe. If that means a dented hull, I've got paint." She signed off. Torvan sat on his bridge and felt the exhaustion pressing down on him like gravity. The accumulated weight of 20 hours of crisis, worry, negotiation, and the strange, disorienting experience of being rescued by people he hadn't called, from a species he hadn't known was listening, through a relay that everyone else had forgotten. The convoy reached Dremeli Station 34 hours after the tow began, 2 hours ahead of schedule. Torvan stood on the observation deck of the Velschen drift and watched his grain carriers detach from the Patience's tow cables and glide into Dremeli's cargo bays. 72,000 tons of famine rations, arriving a full day earlier than anyone had projected, because a human tender had pushed them through the void with mass drivers that treated merchant haulers like they were part of the regular fleet. The Dremeli Station's docking authority had been speechless when the convoy arrived. They'd expected the shipment in 3 days. They'd gotten it in 34 hours. And trailing the convoy, sitting quietly in an escort position that spoke of absolute discipline and zero interest in recognition, were 3 human ships that the Dremeli authority's database couldn't identify. "Convoy Lead Kelsch, this is Dremeli Station Control. We are confirming receipt of the famine relief shipment. All 4 grain carriers have docked and unloading has begun, but we need to ask the 3 unidentified vessels in your formation. They're broadcasting Terran call signs. Are those human ships?" "They are Dremeli Control. They saved the convoy." A long silence. Then, "We didn't know humans came out this far." "Neither did we." Torvan made one more walk through his ship before docking was complete. He stopped at the engineering bay, where Krelt was running diagnostics on the patched impeller with the reverent focus of a priest examining a sacred text. "How's the repair holding?" Torvan asked. Krelt didn't look up. "Captain, I have been maintaining Veshan graviton impellers for 26 years. This patch was done by aliens who have never seen our drive systems in person. It is tighter, cleaner, and more structurally sound than any yard work I have ever inspected." He finally turned. "They used a bonding compound I've never encountered. I asked the human engineer about it. He said it was standard field repair alloy." "Standard, Captain. They carry this as standard." Torvan placed his claw on Krelt's shoulder and moved on. He stopped at the Mercy's Reach's berth, where the rescued crew from the Bright Course were disembarking. Selin, the Bright Course's captain, was the last one off. His arms were bandaged where the containment breach had burned him, and he walked with the careful, measured steps of a man who had accepted that his ship was gone but hadn't yet finished grieving it. When he saw Torvan, he stopped. "Convoy Lead. The humans, they recovered my crew's personal belongings from the Bright Course before they scuttled her. Photographs, journals, my navigator's family shrine." His voice wavered. "They didn't have to do that. The ship was a radiation hazard. Nobody boards a radiation hazard to save photographs." "They did." "They did." Selin's mandibles clicked the same soft, involuntary sound that Torvan had been making for hours, the sound of something unclenching. "Who are these people, Kelsch?" Torvan didn't have an answer that would fit into words. Not yet. The formal farewell happened on the Carthage's hangar deck. Tors had invited Torvan, Lisseth, and the captains of all 11 remaining convoy vessels aboard for what she called a debrief. It turned out to be coffee. Torvan had never tasted coffee before. It was dark, bitter, and served in small ceramic cups that the humans handled with a casualness that suggested this ritual was as essential to their species as breathing. Tors poured for each captain personally, and when she reached Torvan she said, "Captain Kelsch, it's been an honor." He held the cup, the warmth soaked into his claws. Around him, 12 alien captains Veshan, Drelkathi, Reshkari, Pelachi stood in a human warship's hangar bay, drinking human coffee, alive because a 300-year-old relay had bounced a signal to a species that nobody had asked for help. Commander Tors, his voice was rough. The exhaustion was catching up and something else was catching up with it, something that sat in his chest like a weight being lifted and a weight being placed simultaneously as though the relief and the gratitude were the same thing. I have been running convoys for 14 years. I have lost ships. I have lost crew. I have spent weeks stranded in corridors where no help came because no one was listening. His mandibles clicked, not bitterness, not amusement, but something softer. You were listening, on a frequency nobody uses, through a relay nobody remembers, for a call that wasn't aimed at you. And you came. You came with engineers and fuel and medical teams and coffee. You towed my grain carriers to a starving colony, and then you stood an escort like it was the most natural thing in the universe. Tors was quiet. The hangar bay was quiet. 12 captains stood with their coffee cups and listened. "I will file my report with the Compact Trade Authority," Torvan continued. "I will tell them what happened here. I will tell them that the species they have classified as restricted and non-participant just saved 12 ships, 437 lives, and an entire colony's food supply. And I will tell them that they did it because they caught a bounce off a dead relay and decided that was reason enough." Tors set down her cup. "Captain Kelsch, we didn't do anything special. We heard a call, we answered. That's all we know how to do." "Then you know how to do the most important thing in the universe, Commander, and you do it well." He drank the coffee. It was terrible. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Seshka, the young Palosi captain, approached Tors after the debrief. Torvan watched the exchange from across the hangar bay. The Drelkathi woman who had held her damaged ship together through a hull breach and a cooling failure and 9 hours of drifting in the dark, stood in front of the human commander and said something too quiet for Torvan to hear. Tors listened, nodded, and then did something that made Seshka go very still. She reached out and placed her hand on the young captain's shoulder, a simple gesture, a human gesture, contact. Seshka's composure broke. Not dramatically, Drelkathi didn't break that way, but her shoulders dropped and her jaw unclenched, and for just a moment the exhaustion and the fear and the relief showed on her face in a way that her angular features had been fighting to suppress for hours. Tors held the contact for exactly the right amount of time, then let go, and said something that made Seshka straighten and nod. Later, when Torvan asked Seshka what Tors had said, the young captain's answer was brief. She said, "You held your ship together. That's not nothing." And then she said, "Go home, Captain, you've earned the rest." Morven, the Coldwalk's captain, presented Tors with the first dose of the vaccine that his refrigeration unit repaired by human engineers, powered by human fuel, had kept alive through the crisis. "This is the reason my cargo matters, Commander. 800 units, an entire colony's defense against a plague. Your people kept my refrigerators running. If you hadn't," he stopped. His 4 Reshkari hands opened and closed, grasping for words that weren't there. "Commander, I've been a merchant for 30 years. Nobody has ever fought this hard to save my cargo." Tors accepted the vial, examined it, and handed it back. "It's your cargo, Captain Morven. We just kept the lights on." The humans departed quietly. The Carthage, the patience, and the kindness pulled away from Dremeli Station in a formation that was as clean and disciplined as their arrival. No ceremony, no farewell broadcast, no request for recognition or compensation or future consideration. They had come because they heard a signal. They had done everything they could, and now they were leaving. Torvald watched them go from the Velschen Drift's observation deck. 3 dark shapes against the bright curve of Dremeli's atmosphere, shrinking into the void like a memory settling into place. Commander Lisseth filed her report that evening. It was 17 pages long and concluded with a single recommendation: reclassify the Terran species immediately. Current designation of limited spacefaring non-participant restricted contact is catastrophically inaccurate. Recommend full contact, mutual aid treaty, and permanent invitation to compact convoy protection rotations. These people do not wait to be asked. They listen. They come. They bring everything, and they stay until it's done. The Compact Trade Authority received the report, Torvald's deposition, and the individual testimonies of 12 convoy captains. The file was flagged for review at the next session. 6 months later, the file was still flagged. But something had changed anyway. Convoy captains in the Palachi outer lanes had started including the old relay frequencies in their emergency broadcast protocols, not because the Compact told them to, not because anyone had issued a directive, because word had gotten around, the way it always does among people who spend their lives in the space between ports, that if you were out there and you were in trouble and your signal happened to reach the right old relay on the right forgotten frequency, there was a species on the other end who kept the lights on. They listened to everything, and when they heard you, they came. Torvald Kelsch returned to merchant service. He ran convoys for another 11 years. He never lost a ship again. And on the bridge of every vessel he captained, next to the standard compact emergency transmitter, he kept a small, secondary unit one that broadcast on the old frequencies, the forgotten bands, the decommissioned channels that nobody used and nobody monitored. Nobody, that is, except the humans. He never needed it, but he kept it, because the day he stopped listening was the day someone might drown in the dark. And Torvald Kelsch, who had once drifted in the void with 12 ships and 400 souls and no hope, and who had been pulled back by people who heard a signal that wasn't aimed at them, and came anyway, understood that there were worse habits than keeping the light on in a relay that everyone else had forgotten. He kept it on. And sometimes, late in the watch, when the convoy was quiet and the stars were still, and the hum of the engines was the only sound in the universe, he would pour himself a cup of something dark and bitter that he'd learned to buy at human trading posts, terrible stuff, really, an acquired taste at best, and he would look at the little secondary transmitter blinking steadily in the dark, and he would feel it again. The unclenching, the weight being lifted, the quiet, bone-deep gratitude of a man who had been drowning and felt a hand close around his wrist, and looked up, and saw that the hand belonged to someone who had been listening on a frequency that no one else used, through a relay that no one else remembered, for a call that no one else would have answered. Grateful exhaustion. That was the only name for it. He drank his coffee, he watched the relay light blink, and he kept the frequency open, just in case someone else was drowning in the dark.